Good evening, everyone. So nice to see you all here. On behalf of the Sociology and Anthropology Department, the Department of Women's and Gender Studies, and the Communication Program, we are thrilled and honored to welcome Dr. Jill Walsh, Lecturer of Sociology and founder of Digital Age, and Attorney Liza M. Hirsch, Director of the Children's Justice Unit in the Office of Massachusetts Attorney General Andrea Joy Campbell, to Providence College this evening for their talk, Cell Phones and Social Media, the Impact on Young Adult Mental Health. Such a timely subject and lived reality with relevance for so many of us individually, for our families, for our students. I am currently teaching a SOC WGS communication course, Gender in the Body in Media and Pop Culture, for instance, and social media and cell phones and their intersections are a primary source, if not the primary source, of meaning-making, identity construction, communication, and news for many, if not all, of my students, as well as for my own teenage kids and even myself. Indeed, social media is an essential source of information, knowledge building, connection, community, and activism, as well as rampant and growing disinformation and misinformation, inclusive of racism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, hate, and incitations to violence for infinite numbers of individuals and entities, both corporate and governmental, and their intersections. I'd like to take a moment now to just share a little bit more about our two powerhouse speakers tonight, Dr. Jill Walsh and Attorney Liza Hirsch, and then we will offer them a warm welcome. But first, Dr. Jill Walsh is a sociology lecturer and researcher at Boston University. She's also the founder of Digital Age, a consulting group that educates students, families, and educational institutions about positive technology use. She earned a PhD in sociology from Boston University, a master's in public policy from Brown University, and a BA from Harvard University. Before graduate school, she taught 9th through 12th grade at an independent school. Her research looks at the ways that digital media use impacts psychosocial well-being and development. Her book, Adolescents and Their Social Media Narratives, A Digital Coming of Age, was published in 2017, and she publishes academic journal articles in sociology, education, and adolescent development. Her research interests include social media and identity work, parasocial relationships, mental health, and digital hate speech. Attorney Liza M. Hirsch is director of the Children's Justice Unit at the Massachusetts Attorney General's Office, where she works to advance justice and equity for Massachusetts children and youth through civil investigations, litigation, policy, and community engagement. She is a member of the AGO team working to address the impacts of social media on youth mental health. Prior to joining the AGO, Liza was senior attorney at Massachusetts Advocates for Children, where she provided representation to low-income families in special education and school discipline matters, and directed a program on disrupting the school-to-prison pipeline. She previously worked as a manager in the Holyoke Public Schools and as a Skadden Fellow staff attorney at Massachusetts Law Reform Institute and at Medical Legal Partnership Boston, where she represented homeless and low-income families in housing and shelter matters. She is a graduate of Northeastern University School of Law. And she also happens to be the daughter of our phenomenal professor, Dr. Eric Hirsch, in sociology and anthropology. It was just super cool. So without further ado, please offer a warm welcome to these powerhouse speakers, and we will have you come on up to the panel. Yes, yeah. I'm going to stay up here for the slides.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you so much, Abigail, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you all so much for being here and spending your, Wednesday night here with us. So really appreciate you all being here tonight. As Abigail mentioned, my name is Liza Hirsch. I'm the director of the Children's Justice Unit at the Massachusetts Attorney General's Office. And just to provide a little bit more context about the Attorney General's Office and about state Attorney General's offices more broadly, We often refer to our office as the people's law firm. So we represent the interests of the people and the public against the interests of big corporations and other broad systemic forces. I direct the Children's Justice Unit, which means I represent the interests of all children and youth in Massachusetts. But of course, the work that we do is relevant here in Rhode Island and in other places as well. Tonight we're going to be talking about social media and the impact of social media on youth mental health, the mental health of young people and people more broadly, but particularly on young people and youth. And I just wanted to highlight that our office is tackling this issue from a variety of angles. So we have filed litigation against Meta, the parent company of Instagram and Facebook, for harming the mental health of young people. We filed a lawsuit also against TikTok for the same reasons. And we're one of over 40 states, both Democratic and Republican, across the country that have filed litigation against these companies for using psychologically manipulative tactics to hook young people on their platforms. And they don't have the interests of young people in mind, unfortunately. We also have filed legislation, state legislation in Massachusetts. We're one of many states that have done this. There's also pending federal legislation on these issues. So Massachusetts and many states are working to tackle these issues and hold these companies accountable. And we also do a lot of work on public education and coming out and talking to young people and making sure that young people know about the ways in which these companies are operating. So that's just a bit of a preview of some of what we're going to cover tonight. So my goals tonight are to inform you about how social media companies operate and how they purposely design their platforms to be addictive. To equip you with the information that you need to inform your own social media habits, and to empower you to become more involved in broader efforts to make social media safe for young people and all people and hold companies accountable. So we're going to start with a poll. This is a judgment-free zone here. Raise your hand if you use Instagram. And I'm going to raise my hand because I have Instagram. Okay, so I think everyone, or almost everyone. TikTok? Okay, almost everyone. Facebook? Okay, that's more than I was expecting. Facebook is kind of known as like the older generation platform at this point, but most of you have Facebook. Snapchat? Okay, that's interesting because it's all of the young people and none of the older people. YouTube? This one is like pretty much universal. Twitter or X? Okay, interesting, fewer. Okay, and then I'm gonna just do these three all at once because I barely know what they are. Raise your hand if you use Discord, Reddit, or Twitch. Okay, so a couple of people, but mostly Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat, YouTube, and Facebook. Okay, so raise your hand if you know who this character is, you recognize this character. Okay, so that makes sense. This is, so one of the people from an older generation, you want to say that, do you remember the name of this character?
I remember it's a Camel cigarette.
Yeah.
Is it Joe?
It's Joe.
Yeah.
Yes, this is Joe Camel. And this was an advertising campaign used by the Camel cigarette company back in the 80s, 1980s, to advertise cigarettes. And who do you think, if you'd raise your hand and just tell me who you think this advertisement is targeted for? Who are they trying to appeal to and sell cigarettes to in this ad? Raise your hand if you have an idea. Yeah.
So, based on the fact that it's cartoon, they're definitely appealing to a younger audience. It's the same thing with vapes, like with the flavor, different types of flavors. They're appealing to younger kids. Then that's when they ban flavors, right? This is who they're appealing to.
Yep, That's 100% correct. So here they are targeting to young people, to youth, even arguably to children, in order to get young people hooked on their products early so that they can make money not only now, but throughout the lifespan of these young people. They also were aware at the time that young people are more susceptible to advertising, right? Because their brains are not fully developed. And thank you for previewing the next portion of my slide. So who's heard of Juul? Raise your hand if you've heard of Juul. Okay, so almost everyone. This is an e-cigarette company. Raise your hand if you can tell me who Juul is advertising to here. Are they advertising to senior citizens, the older elderly? Who are they targeting here? Yeah, teenagers, youth, as you mentioned, the flavors, and we actually recently settled a huge lawsuit with Juul and brought hundreds of millions of dollars back into states for the harms of the Juul company in harming youth due to addiction associated with these products that were clearly specifically targeted toward young people in an effort to get them hooked. So social media, same but different. Social media companies are using the same playbook as big tobacco and e-cigs, marketing to youth and also designing their platforms for youth consumption. But why? Why target young people specifically? Does anyone have any ideas on this? Why would social media companies want to target young people specifically? Yeah.
I think one thing is that usually like younger audiences are a bit easier to manipulate or like get hooked in the first place, like their brains aren't fully formed.
Yes. Yeah.
And also you can potentially hook them for the life course.
Yes.
Get them young and they can develop habits that will be profitable for longer periods of time.
Exactly. So 100% both of those comments. Social media companies know that young people's brains are still developing and that they don't, for example, have a fully developed prefrontal cortex. They have less ability to inhibit impulses than adults do. And so these companies actually presented to their staff, to their employees, showing diagrams of the adolescent brain, showing that it's not fully developed and that youth are more vulnerable to impulses, and then specifically targeted adolescents and young adults because they knew it would be easier to get them hooked on the platform. And like Abigail shared, they would then have those users for their lifespan. So that was the strategy. And what are the companies getting out of this? Any thoughts? Yeah. Bingo. Ad revenue. So how much money do you think social media companies made in just 1 year, in 2022, based on advertising only to young people between the ages of 18 and 21? And before I ask this question, raise your hand if you're between the ages of 18 and 21. Okay, so all of you in this room and your peers, how much money do you think the social media companies made in 1 year, the social media companies that we talked about combined, from advertising to you? Maybe, does anyone want to just throw out a guess? Yeah.
1 billion.
1 billion, any other guesses? Okay, so let's just go through some multiple choice here. Who thinks 250 million? No. What about 820 million? 2.6 billion? Okay, so we got some nods, okay. What about 7.3 billion? Okay, so the answer is D, 7.3 billion. That's not million, that's $1 billion that social media companies earned based on only the accounts of young people between the ages of 18 and 21 in 1 year. And what about, does anyone have any guesses for how much money they made based on youth accounts for those under age 18? Any just throw out a ballpark? Between 5 and 10 billion, okay, all right. $11 billion. That's based on youth accounts for young people, for teenagers under the age of 18. So now we have some insight into why these companies are targeting young people. This is just a chart that shows the ad revenue. This is for the ad revenue earned based on youth accounts, counts for those under the age of 18. You can see Instagram earned the most, followed by TikTok and YouTube. And raise your hand if you've seen this documentary, The Social Dilemma. Okay, cool, a few of you. So we're gonna hear a little bit more about the ways in which these companies operate to produce this ad revenue.
A lot of people think Google's just a search box and Facebook's just a place to see what my friends are doing. What they don't realize is there's entire teams of engineers whose job is to use your psychology against you.
I was the co-inventor of the Facebook like button.
I was the president of Pinterest.
Google, Twitter,
Instagram.
There were meaningful changes happening around the world because of these platforms. I think we were naive about the flip side of that coin.
We get rewarded by hearts, likes, thumbs up, and we conflate that with value and we conflate it with truth.
a whole generation is more anxious, more depressed.
I always felt like fundamentally it was a force for good. I don't know if I feel that way anymore.
So recommend that documentary for those of you who have not seen it. Definitely worth seeing. So let's talk a little bit about the numbers. Almost all young adults use some form of social media. 76% of young adults ages 18 to 24 use Instagram, 75% use Snapchat, 55% TikTok, and 95% YouTube. Those numbers actually seem a little low to me. I think it might be even more than that. And young people under the age of 18, the data show that these numbers are even higher. And according to one recent survey, adults ages 18 to 24, again, your age cohort, spend over 3 hours per day on social media. And research also shows that using social media for more than 3 hours per day doubles the risk that teens and young adults will have poor mental health. And the US Surgeon General even issued a warning about this recently. In 2023, the Surgeon General is the official who issues warnings and advisory labels on cigarette packages, other products. And the US Surgeon General stated in his advisory, we are in the middle of a national youth mental health crisis, and I am concerned that social media is an important driver of that crisis, one that we must urgently address. So what are the harms? What are the impacts on youth? Studies have shown that particularly for young people who use social media compulsively, like as in they're constantly checking social media, and youth who are using it for long periods of time, so 3 hours a day or more, that type of social media use is associated with sleep issues, feeling bad about your body, disordered eating, and eating disorders, negatively comparing yourself to others, low self-esteem, depression, anxiety, and self-harm. This is especially true for teenage girls and young women. And let's watch a short clip to think a little bit more about the psychological mechanisms that these companies are using to hook young people, all users, but particularly young people on their platforms.
You really want to know what's going on inside their head. Our brains are intricate networks of neurons, cells that communicate using chemical messenger molecules called neurotransmitters. Dopamine is a vital neurotransmitter responsible for pleasure, motivation, and rewards. When it comes to social media use, dopamine can be activated in powerful and problematic ways, especially for teens. Social media platforms engage us using bottomless content feeds, like and share buttons, and an overwhelming number of other features, each one a little reward that releases a dopamine spike and leaves us wanting more. That feeling of approval from likes and shares can lead to unhealthy social comparison and can impact a teen's sense of self-worth, both on and offline. With repeated exposure, the brain undergoes neuroadaptation, requiring more stimulation, more likes, to get that same feel-good reaction, resulting in dopamine deficits and dependency. In this vicious cycle, teens use social media more frequently and for longer periods of time as they try to get back to baseline. Luckily, dopamine can be restored to healthy, regulated levels. And not all dopamine-releasing activities are dangerous. Playing with a pet, spending quality time in person with friends or family, even engaging in acts of kindness can release dopamine in balanced, controlled ways. Activities like these promote self-regulation, relaxation, and mindfulness. And unlike social media, they don't leave young people with dopamine deficits. The good news is,
okay, so that gives you a sense of some of the ways in which your brain is operating when you're scrolling through social media. And we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the specific features, but actually I'm going to go back to this slide because I want to ask all of you. You might have seen some of, the answers on that slide, but I want to ask all of you what you think are some of the addictive features on social media, or some of the features that keep users, particularly young adult users, coming back repeatedly to the platform or having a hard time leaving the platform. What are some of those features? Yeah.
On TikTok, especially, like the short form content, like makes it so that you can just like keep going.
Yep.
Like, if you have a short attention span, you can just like keep swiping to the next one.
Yep, the short form videos are one of the most addictive features that these platforms use, and it's sort of TikTok, it was TikTok's hallmark feature, right? And then Instagram adopted it with the Reels, and now, and when you start, like honestly, when you start going through those videos, like time can just pass, and all of a sudden like an hour has gone by, you've been looking at like cute puppies or whatever it is that you're looking at, and you don't even realize you've lost an hour of your life. They're quite addictive, and they're addictive for adults too, right? But even more addictive for teenagers and for young adults whose brains are literally still developing. The young adult brain is still developing until around age 25, and it's the prefrontal cortex that develops last. So it's actually harder for teenagers and young adults in their early 20s to inhibit those impulses and to stop, even if you want to stop and you don't want to keep scrolling, because of your brain development, it's actually harder. What are some other features that are addictive or that keep you coming back or keep you staying on the platform that companies use? Yeah.
Going along with that, it's like building a profile based on what you're spending time watching and interacting with.
Exactly. So the companies use algorithms. I'm sure many, if not all of you, have heard of that, where they're basically collecting data on you, very detailed data about what posts you're looking at, how long you're looking at that post, whether you engage with the content, so whether you like it, whether you comment on it, and the longer you look at a post, the more you engage with it, the company then knows, okay, this is the kind of content that this user is interested in, and they're going to serve up more of that content. But they do it not every post, but they do it on an irregular schedule to keep you sort of craving and wanting more and seeking that dopamine hit, which we're going to be talking a little bit more about. What other features keep you coming back to the platform? Yeah.
Just the fact that it never ends, you can kind of keep scrolling forever, you're just always thinking like, oh, what's next? Like,
Exactly.
now when maybe this.
Exactly. Yep. So that's the infinite scroll feature, which we'll talk more about, which is another one of the tactics used. And you also mentioned another thing, which is the fear of missing out, which is something that the companies are very aware of. They're aware that everyone has that FOMO, fear of missing out, but it's particularly accentuated for young people. Any other features or tactics that anyone wants to mention? Okay, so you got a number of the really important ones, and we're going to go through each one of these. Algorithms, I don't have a separate slide on algorithms, but it's exactly what you described, which is that the companies are taking data on you, determining what kind of content you like, and then serving up that content to tailor your experience, which, in a way seems kind of nice, like, oh, like this is tailored for me. But it's not actually about you, it's about the companies, and the companies making money. So they're serving up that content because they know you'll spend more time on the platform, you're more likely to see ads, and then they'll see their ad revenue increase. Okay, so you mentioned infinite scroll. I don't know if any of you remember the time when you could scroll through your feed and you would actually hit an end point where it would say you're all caught up. That used to be a thing. Now there's no catching up. Like, you're never, ever, ever caught up. You can literally go scroll forever. And that's a decision that the company's made. Like, we're not gonna be caught up, have users catch up anymore on their content. We're gonna just keep feeding them, these addictive reels and images forever. So, and the other thing that a lot of people don't know about is, does anyone recall that when you're swiping or scrolling, there will be those like 3 dots that indicate that the feed is loading? Well, that's actually not that the feed is loading. It's actually a tactic that the companies are using to delay gratification. So they actually have inserted that so that you're actually waiting for that dopamine hit, because they know that that is more addictive and it's more likely to keep you on the platform. So autoplay, this is particularly relevant to YouTube, but also TikTok, Instagram, with Reels, with stories. You start watching one video, and then do you have to click something or engage in some way in order for the next video to come up? No, it just automatically starts playing. So this is what the companies refer to as, not having any friction. Like, there's no friction to start a new video. You don't have to make an intentional choice in order to start another video. You're not using your prefrontal cortex to say, okay, I watched that video, now I want to watch this one. It just automatically plays to the next one, and you just get stuck in this cycle of watching more and more and more videos. Ephemeral content refers to content that is there and then it's gone. So live feed, stories, it sort of has been marketed in a way that this is just like a cool way to stay connected with your friends, see what the, stars are doing. But actually, these are features that have been intentionally used by the companies to make people experience that FOMO, or fear of missing out. Like, if I don't log on right now, I'm gonna miss something, right? Or maybe my friends will see something and I won't see it, and then I'll be out of the loop. And the companies are well aware of FOMO. They study FOMO. They know how to induce FOMO. And they know that young people, teenagers, young adults are more likely to feel that social pressure. So they're more likely to log on for live feeds, or to not want to miss a story of one of their friends. And nonstop notifications. How many people's phones kind of looks like the image on the right-hand side? I know mine does. There's just you just never get a break from constant notifications. There are 40 types of notifications enabled by default on many of these platforms, and you have to go into settings to change that, which most people just don't do. And of course, notifications function to bring people back to the app, because then the companies are going to be earning more money. And this was the concept that I talked a little bit about, which is intermittent variable rewards. It's the exact same tactic that's actually used in gambling and slot machines, where the companies are they're studying your data, they know the content that you like and that you engage with, and then they serve you up that content, but not every post. They do it every 3rd or 4th post, or every 5th post, because that's what's actually most effective, and that is most addictive, and it's more likely to keep you on the platform and keep you engaged than if they served it up every time. So they use this tactic very intentionally. Intermittent variable rewards, it's just like a slot machine. Do you win every time? No, you win every however many times that it takes. And then that dopamine hit, that surge of pleasure, is that much greater. And of course, you might be thinking, well, you're not getting a huge surge of pleasure when you're looking at a puppy video, but it's enough. It's enough to keep you, it's enough of a dopamine hit to keep you on the platform looking at more posts. and also looking at more ads. Social comparison, this is another very powerful driver. This is, I think, one of the major reasons for the association between social media and negative mental health outcomes. Of course, it's the overuse and the compulsive use, but it's also the constant social comparison and the constant feeling like your friends' lives are better than yours because they look incredibly happy, even though it's completely not representative of their actual life. And studies have shown that it makes people feel bad about themselves, and particularly teenagers and young people. If you're just looking, scrolling at one happy picture of your friend after another, you feel bad. And the companies have implemented all of these features, likes, views, comments, that all promote social comparison. And that's because it keeps you coming back. You want to come back. You want to check how many likes you have. You want to see if someone is engaged, if someone has commented. That's why. And actually, Meta implemented an internal research project called Project Daisy, where they actually removed the like button and then studied whether well-being of young people using the app improved when the like button was no longer there. They found that it did. And then the company decided not to eliminate the like button, but to keep the like button because, again, they're really thinking about their bottom line, not youth mental health. There's, of course, also beauty filters, photo editing. I don't think I need to describe how that negatively influences body image and creates all kinds of issues for young people, particularly young women. So I mentioned at the Massachusetts Attorney General's office, we have litigation pending against Meta and TikTok. I can't say too much about that litigation because it is pending, except to say we've filed litigation. And I think it's important for you all to know that, and to know that we're not the only state that did, just to state again that over 40 states, both Democratic and Republican, have filed lawsuits against Meta, and a slightly fewer number against TikTok. And these lawsuits have been filed in either state or federal court. So there's kind of broad consensus now, as people gain more information about how these companies are operating, that they really have been entirely profit-driven and sacrificing the well-being and the needs and mental health needs of young people in the process. We've also been doing a lot of policy work. We recently issued a cell phones and social media in schools toolkit. Worked together with Joe Walsh on this. That's for K-12 schools primarily, but could be useful in the college setting potentially. And as I mentioned, we filed state legislation that would require companies to put more protections in place for youth accounts specifically. Public awareness, education, and obviously involvement of young people, incredibly important. It's much more powerful if we have like a young person up here talking about these issues than for me to be up here talking about these issues. So we actually have engaged a lot of high school students across the state in Massachusetts who are now presenting to their peers. And it's much more compelling than having someone of my generation come and say, well, social media, So we have engaged high school students on this issue, which has been really powerful. So what can you do? Make informed choices about your own use. I'm certainly not thinking that any of you are gonna leave this building and delete all of your social media apps, right? But you might just think about it a little bit more in terms of, when you're using social media, think about the algorithm, right? Think about, notice when you're done using social media how it makes you feel. Do you feel better? Or do you feel worse? And then, adjust your habits accordingly. There are little changes that you can make that actually make a big difference. And like I said, a lot of the negative mental health outcomes are really associated with overuse and compulsive use. So a little bit here and there, it's fine. But just pay attention to your own habits, your own patterns, and how you feel when you use social media, and then you can make adjustments accordingly for yourself. Organize with peers around the issue, get involved with organizations and policy efforts to hold companies accountable, and spend time doing in-person off-screen activities, which I'm sure all of you do. But needless to say, the research shows that there are more positive mental health effects of in-person and off-screen activities. So I think now I'm going to turn it over to Jill Walsh to take us a little bit deeper into some of the research on these issues. And I think we're going to do question and answers and discussion after both of our presentations, so there will be more opportunity for that.
Okay, well, I would love to hear, how many of you are sociology majors or concentrators? Raise your hand if that, okay, not a few. Okay, well, so I am a sociologist. For those of you in the field, I'm interested in microsociology, so I'm very interested in individual identity development in adolescence and also how peer relationships can impact those processes. And I've always been interested in the way that social networks impact health. I used to look at physical health and the way that some friend groups are really protective around health issues in adolescence, and other friend groups, there can sometimes be, it's less protective, it's less helpful around physical health issues. And probably about 15 years ago, I kind of migrated into thinking more about mental health in adolescence, and it was around the time, probably all of you are too young to use these things, but it was around the time of MySpace. And so I used to ask 9th through 12th graders about MySpace, and now you can probably imagine I spend time talking to like 3rd graders about Snapchat. So the field has definitely changed with it, but I want to share some of the things that sort of really resonate for me, both in the time that I spend, again, like 2nd and 3rd grade through 12th grade, but then also with my college students at BU. So I teach a society and technology class where certainly we talk a lot about social media, and I also teach the sociology of mental illness. And so that's there as well. So a couple things, like from my perspective as a sociologist, there are clearly, and I don't disagree with anything Liza shared in terms of the links between social media use and mental health. I think one of the challenging things for us as researchers is that when you actually look at the data, it's a little bit of a mixed bag, right? It absolutely depends on how long people are on, right? That is clearly a factor. It also certainly, you can all agree with this, like it depends on what you're looking at, right? It is substantively different if I'm talking to a 10th grader who like wants to learn how to do a cool skateboarding move and they're watching YouTube to learn the skill, and they're actually out there practicing it. They might be on YouTube for an hour. That's very different from what Liza was talking about, of like the infinite scroll of just watching the next YouTube video that gets loaded. So a lot of it is that, and then of course it's all like we bring ourselves to the digital spaces, right? So challenges we have offline are challenges we then experience online, and of course that depends. And then the other thing that I think is really important, both for you all just to be thinking about in your own relationships with technology, but also as you're critical consumers of the data, it is absolutely the case that technology can cause mental health problems, absolutely. It is also the case that a lot of people use technology as a coping mechanism to manage their mental health. And so I'll give you an example, right? And I'm not picking on, I actually love video games, you can ask me. I'm not a video game player, but I love what they do for people. I'll just use a video games example. Do any of you play video games? At all, a little bit? Like, it could be Candy Crush counts in this context. Okay, so I will tell you that video games are actually really helpful way to manage anxiety symptoms. Anyone have any thoughts why? How might a video game be helpful for managing anxiety? What do you think? What is it about video games? What are you trying to do in a video game? Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, right? So you get a semblance of control, right? Where when things in your head might feel really out of control, gaming is a place where you're gonna get control and also try to win, right? And so if you're doing those things, and if any of you have seen like some of the amazing technology connected to some of the more popular video games right now, you will know that like to try to win those games, you have to be fully present, right? And so you can't really be like, ruminating on why did I say that? That was so dumb. You can't really do that. And you also can't be like, well, what if? What if this happens? What if this awful thing happens, right? Thinking forward. So one of the things we often see is that there are some people who overuse video games and that creates mental health problems for them. And there's other people for whom they are dealing with a mental health problem, and they use video games as a coping mechanism. Now, I'm not suggesting either of those is a good scenario, but we definitely want to be thinking about directionality as we think about how to manage that, right? Because you can imagine if it is one person's coping mechanism, and we suddenly, right, if I'm talking to parents and they say, well, the video games are so awful, so I'm just not letting my kid play at all. Without building up other coping mechanisms, it can actually create more problems for kids, right? So having a sense of that, you can imagine scrolling through social media gives an escape, right? It's a break from our lives, which can be connected to things like depression. So that understanding the directionality is a real trick for us. But I did want to highlight a couple of studies that I thought would be particularly relevant for all of you, given where you are in your life course and thinking about sort of some of your experiences through middle school and high school. The first one I wanted to highlight is this really interesting study, because for years and years, like if I came 3 or 4 years ago, I would have said to you, okay, so we have some hunches about stuff, we think we understand, but we don't have any longitudinal data. Right, like people aren't old enough. And so, yeah, we have some people that have had it for 4 or 5 years, but we don't really know. We are now starting to get that longitudinal data, and so we can really start to understand. So a couple of the studies I want to highlight here are longitudinal, and that means a lot to me, right? Understanding how this impacts you over the course of your life, I think is a really critical factor. So the first one, this Bergeri study, what they did was, believe it or not, Facebook was the first social media platform to come to college campuses. And it was kind of a big deal, right? Like colleges got Facebook. That was like a thing. And they actually had to allow it at the time. Like they had to agree to it. So you can actually look, and the researchers did this, they looked at when Facebook arrived on college campuses and the utilization of mental health services before and after. And they looked at this over, it wasn't just like day 1, day 2. They looked at it over a year span. And what they found in every case in every college, after they got access to Facebook, utilization of mental health services went up. Now, we don't know, right? So there's 2 possible explanations. One explanation, of course, is that it caused problems for people, right? And they needed to seek out help. You could imagine too, though, as a sociologist, I'm always thinking about like what's missing, who might be missing, right? And one of the possible answers is that people felt incredible stigma around their mental health. They weren't in communities where that was discussed. And then they saw people on social media, perhaps talking about living with ADHD or living with depression. And then they suddenly were like, oh, that's me, and I could actually access resources, right? So it's possible that it goes both ways, but it is pretty stark that every campus in America, utilization of mental health services went up. So I think that's important to note. The second study is also a longitudinal study. So this was a study, Amy Orban is to me like a gold standard researcher on this, and she always looks at these meta-analyses. So she's kind of saying, what can we, if I look at all the studies out there, what can I actually say? And so I really always sort of go to her as kind of my North Star of research, and she's very balanced. And so for her to come out and say this, I thought this was something I paid a lot of attention to. I will tell you all, like, you're not in this boat, but it impacted me enough that I actually changed my parenting. And so my younger kid did not get social media at 13 when she was hoping to, and as you can probably imagine, it went over really well. But that's how compelled I was. So anyway, here's what she did. She looked at the mental health of young adults, 18 to 24, so your age range. And she asked how they were doing at that moment. And then she asked them when they got access to social media. And what she found was that people who got access to social media between ages roughly 11 to 13, it's a little bit of a bell curve, so it goes, a bit beyond that, but roughly for everyone 11 to 13, they reported worse mental health as young adults. And she's calling that a window of developmental sensitivity, that 11 to 13 window, as being really impactful. For any of you who've worked with children or know some stuff or have read some things about adolescent development and identity work, that doesn't surprise me. Like 11 to 13 is pretty pivotal. That's those middle school years, right? If you need a reminder. And you might remember like walking in a pack with everybody and having no opinions of your own except for what does everybody else think, and a lot of that kind of stuff. And so having a little bit of that experience buffered from all the things Liza was talking about, the likes, the filters, all of that kind of stuff seems to be beneficial. The other interesting thing she found, though, was another really pivotal window was age 19. So again, so social media, like for her, basically, I'm going to say roughly 15, 16, 17, 18, people were doing okay. And then at 19, it was hard again. And I think that's really interesting. And she's exploring more in her current research about why that might be. But one of the things she posits that I think could be pretty interesting to think about is moments of transition. Right, those like early, perhaps college or early independence years, right, being pretty pivotal for one's development, and that it might like sort of resurge again. Those social comparisons might hit harder at 19 than they might have at 17 or 18. So I think that's really interesting to think about from that lens. The other thing I just wanted to highlight, that I'm going to talk a little bit about the impact of consuming a lot of news content on social media. But one of the things that we know for certain, and this is pretty recent research from the University of Michigan, that shows that anger and cynicism absolutely is correlated with increased social media use. So the more we use social media, the more angry we are and the more cynical we are. As many of you probably know, moods can be contagious, and unfortunately, usually it's the negative emotions that are more contagious, right? So seeing a lot of things that make us feel angry, it actually stays with us after we stop consuming. So even if you're angry and then you look at a puppy, you still actually retain the anger longer than you retain that quick dopamine hit of looking at the puppy. So just a couple things I wanted to highlight as you think about, while I say a lot we're still trying to understand, there is still some things to think about. And then I wanted to share this because I just think to keep it front of mind for all of you, a lot of people ask me, including my college students, like, when do I know this has crossed into things to worry about, right? So I just wanted to share this briefly. The first thing is this great idea I got from Carrie James, who's a researcher at Harvard, which is that, we kind of think about we should think about social media as a social space, right? It's like where we hang out, we connect with other people, all of that stuff. And as many of you probably know, when you go to social things, like sometimes it's awesome, right? Most of the time it's like, fine, that was nice. Every so often it goes south real fast, right? And you're like, I need to leave, right? It's time to go, right? Or something like that is happening. And the social media space should be pretty similar, right? I'm not expecting everyone's experience on social media to be amazing every single day, every moment you're there. But it should be kind of like a seesaw. It should be most of the time pretty like, yeah, that was fine. And every so often great, and every so often bad. But what we want to be paying attention to is people for whom every time they go on, right? Whether it's, if I was talking to middle schoolers, I might say like instances of bullying, like every time they're engaging, it's negative, right? But you could think about, spaces you might be where it's eliciting negative experiences, whether that's consuming the news, whether that's the social comparison stuff, whatever it is. So thinking about it through that lens. The other thing, of course, is this rumination, right? Ruminating is when our brains are on the hamster wheel of just thinking over and over again about things that happened. And we don't need social media to ruminate, absolutely, but social media makes it easier because we can keep looking at the things, right? So we can keep looking at the picture, we can keep looking at the text, we can keep, right? And it sort of feeds the ruminating beast. So we want to pay attention to that. Certainly you all know this, you've probably been hearing this since 6th grade, but the impact on your, sleep for your overall well-being is critical. And one of the pathways we know that technology impacts mental health is its impact on sleep. So people who are, sleeping right next to their phone, responding to it all night, like that has an impact on their sleep, which has an impact on their well-being. So that's another thing we want to look at. And then another thing, which I'll gloss over briefly, but I want to talk about more, is the concerning behaviors that get amplified online, right? So this could be, there's, a lot of spaces, there's a lot of communities, especially within TikTok. I'm going to pick on TikTok a little bit around mental health, and I think it's warranted. And, there's a lot of communities within TikTok that are really about connection and belonging around really dangerous and harmful behaviors. And so I think it's really important we want to pay attention to those, and I'll talk about them in a minute. The one thing I wanted to highlight that might not be on your radar is this idea that I sort of live in the sociology department, but you will see I kind of straddle like social psychology, and at BU we have a division of emerging media, and so I hang out there as well. And one of the things we talk about in emerging media is how we use technology to manage our moods. If I was being really obnoxious, I would call it a digital pacifier, right? But it's the idea that like anytime we're like, oh, I feel anxious, oh, I feel bored, oh, I'm stressed, we just pull out our phones, right? And this is not a teenage problem, this is an everybody problem, right? I have my undergrads at BU, I have them take the T and not look at their phones. And then they have to write about it, and it's really funny reading their responses, right? Like one person this semester was like, I made eye contact with somebody on the train, right? I was like horrified that had happened, right? Other people are like, it was so weird. And a lot of people talked about how uncomfortable it was, right? Really just felt uncomfortable to wait, right? All of that kind of stuff. So we use it all the time, right, to manage our moods. We tend to use it to manage our difficult moods, right? You noticed I didn't say when we're happy, we use it to get happier, right? We use it when we're sort of feeling that overwhelmed, stuck feeling. And two things I wanted to highlight that I think are really impactful for mental health is the ability to tolerate distress or uncertainty and boredom. Both of which are really critical, and hopefully I'm going to make a case for them. Maybe some of you are bored right now, and so then this is happening for you, which is great. The first one, right, discomfort and uncertainty, right? I see this all the time. I was actually with a school in Connecticut last Monday, and I was talking to the preschool and kindergarten teachers about going out for recess. And they don't use technology in their classrooms, right, in preschool. And they were saying, okay, so we were deciding if we had to wear coats, right? It's, that weird New England weather. Do we need to wear coats? And so the teacher said, so I went to the window and I started looking out the window. And the kids were like, why aren't you just looking at your phone? Like, get the info from your phone. Right, and it was like, why would I look out the window or test the weather myself when I can just get the answer on my phone? Now, that's a very small example, and I, of course, look at the weather on my phone, so I'm not suggesting that's bad. But one of the things we are seeing is like people's inability to tolerate uncertainty, to tolerate discomfort. And I think that, has long-term implications that we don't really know entirely yet, but we certainly know, I'll give you one example. Long Island University right now, they have an entire anxiety clinic targeted to kids and teens. They have moved almost exclusively away from doing cognitive behavioral therapy and individual therapy. And what they're actually doing is they're giving kids responsibilities. They're giving them chores, and they're asking them to just be like independent in their lives. And they are finding, believe it or not, the same success rate that they were seeing with engaging with cognitive behavior therapy, which is the premier treatment for anxiety, cognitive behavior therapy, right? So what they're finding is actually by having kids walk the dog, take the trash out, get a part-time job after school, they're actually more buffered from their anxiety symptoms than if they were seeing a therapist once a week. It's kind of interesting. But I notice this in my students, right? When I, if you take sociology classes, you will know I ask as many questions as I answer, right? So if someone asks me a question and I'll be like, I don't know, what do we think, right? And I've noticed in the last couple of years, fewer and fewer students feel comfortable with that. Right, this real I need to know the answer. And I think that comes so much from our ability to just Google everything, right? Or ChatGPT, the answer to every possible thing. And so I do think about that as a component. And then the case for boredom. Boredom is vital to our lives. It's actually where we do some of our most important work. It is where we are the most creative is actually coming out of boredom. It's where we recover and rest, right? Our brains actually need some rest that isn't just sleep. They just need some downtime. It is also where we do some problem solving. And it is actually the place for self-reflection, which is the thing that I wanted to talk to you all about. And the critical thing about this is that, again, the second we feel bored, our temptation is to pull out our phones, right? And I find myself doing this. I'm not blaming anyone. I was finding I have a 7-minute walk from my office to my classroom. And every single day, I was putting my AirPods in and listening to a podcast, catching up with something, voice texting somebody, right? And then I get to class and yammer away for 75 minutes, and then I get back, my walk back, do the exact same thing. And I'd be like, why am I so stressed all the time? Right? And I started looking into some of this research, and I actually started to say, okay, for the 7 minutes that I walk from my office to my classroom, I'm not going to listen to anything. I can tell you now that it's had a hugely positive impact, but I can also tell you it was incredibly hard when I first started doing it. And that sounds really embarrassing, right? 7 minutes left with my thoughts, like that should be manageable for me as a grown adult. And actually it was really hard. So let me tell you a little bit about why self-reflection is so important. One of the things that we know, and this is borrowing from the great Erik Erikson, who in the 1960s came up with these stages of development, right? And to get through what he referred to as adolescent development, you had to to get through it and be well, right, psychologically well, you had to do two things, right? And he argues, which I actually think is pretty radical in 2025, he argues that the entire work of adolescence is doing two things. One is hanging out with your friends away from adults. And the other one is time for self-reflection. And having those two experiences is how you figure out the answers to his two big questions, which are, where do I fit in / belong? And the most important one is, who am I? Right? And I just do think that we don't do a lot of that anymore, right? Hanging out looks different. For many kids I talk to, they actually don't even have time to hang out, right? Schedules are being what they are. And then the sort of idea of reflecting on the experience is completely gone because that's hard, right? Who wants to think about who am I? Right? If you ask me right now, if you were like, who are you? I'd be like, I have no idea, right? So that's a hard question to answer, much easier to look at a video on TikTok, right? And yet, that we know is so important to have an answer to. Now, it's not an answer for all time. I am not suggesting that any 18-year-old I talk to is like, here's who I am. And it's that, right? But you have to have an answer. You have to have a sense. Okay, so here's how it sounds when I'm talking to high school kids. So juniors and seniors in high school are like, I totally get what you're talking about. And they are like, here, and they will share with me the questions that they don't answer. Things like, ones I've heard recently, I'm actually failing science and I have no idea what to do about it, right? One I heard recently was, I think I actually don't agree with my parents and their political views, but I'm not sure what to do about it. Another one I heard recently was, I've been playing this sport since kindergarten and I actually think I hate it. Good thing to figure out, right? But those, you agree with me, those are big questions, right? And then my personal favorite, I had a focus group, and they were really getting into this question. And this one student goes, I know, you know what I have to figure out? And I was like, what? Great. And she goes, why am I a jerk all the time? And I was like, that's a great question to figure out an answer to, right? So yeah, it runs the gamut is what I'm trying to say. But here's the critical thing. When we aren't thinking about those things, right, our brain can hold off, it can delay on it, but they don't go away, right? And so what most people are finding, again, adults, teens, everybody, is that we put off having all these thoughts, and then when we get into bed and we suddenly don't have our phones, our brains are like, here we go, let's deal with all these things we didn't deal with all day, right? And so then what a lot of people are telling me is I finally get into bed, I'm so exhausted, and then my brain kicks in, and I can't go to sleep, right? And so there again, that's the impact on sleep, right, if we're doing it at all. But this has become really pervasive, right? I talk to people who tell me that they, instead of and I share this often, it's an example I hear a lot, and I'll just use The Office as one example, but when they go to take a shower, they put on a Netflix show to be distracted by the voices. They're not watching the show. They're just being distracted. Right, so the idea of even just taking a shower is hard, right? And so I think there's a real impact, and again, it's not the phone that's doing this, but the phone allows us to not do the important work. And I don't know, right, but we certainly have known for many years that this is really critical. Self-reflection is a really, really critical component of our well-being, and I do feel really comfortable saying we're not doing it. So I call it a loss of an inner life, right? This idea of having some time to ourselves and our thoughts. And again, it's a muscle, right? I told you 7 minutes was hard for me. So even just thinking about 2 or 3 minutes, right? Can you do have your breakfast and not look at your phone? right? Test it out and see, right? It's really interesting to see if we can get comfortable with our thoughts. Another one that I wanted to share with all of you, you might have experienced it at some point in your life. This is definitely the #1 topic that teenagers want to talk to me about when I go to visit schools. I always, like, even if I'm talking about the algorithm, I will just throw this out there so that kids feel comfortable talking to me after. And this is always the thing where I have a line of kids, which is friends who are serving as mental health counselors for their peers. And it happens, again, it's not because of the phone, but the phone allows it to be so pervasive in people's lives. So the first thing is like the disinhibition. You know how we always talk about hiding behind our phones? One of the things that when we are behind a phone, we might feel more comfortable sharing things that are really hard to say face to face, right? So people often share mental health struggles that they're having with people in text, in message, DMs, things like that. And so what of course happens is the person trying to be the best possible friend, right? They will be like, oh my gosh, how can I help? And then a lot of people are finding themselves, and I'm saying this in a friend context, it can also be in a romantic partnership as well, where the person is now on the receiving end or sort of feels responsible for the other person's mental well-being. And I think this is really, really quite pervasive. And how kids will explain it to me, they'll say like things like, well, I'm their person. I have to have my phone with me all the time so I can answer them because I'm their person. Right, and you can imagine, right, it's too much for both kids. It's so unsafe, right, for both kids in that scenario. But the really interesting question that they ask me all the time, and the first time I heard it, I was like, could I get back to you in a couple weeks? Because I was like, I actually don't know the answer to this, was what's the difference between being a supportive friend and a counselor? I mean, I know credentials, right, but beyond that, like, what's the difference? Because they're like, yeah, I want to be a supportive friend. You're telling me not to be a counselor. I get that. What's the line? Right? That's a really hard question to think about. So I offer that to you just to keep in the back of your mind. Liza spoke about the algorithms and the rabbit holes, so I don't want to spend too much time on this. The only thing I wanted to add is some really interesting research that's come out in the last 2 years about how they are baiting us with some early content, particularly young people. And this is particularly happening on TikTok, although it's certainly, I would imagine at this point, also happening on Instagram. But I have better data on TikTok, so I'll share that. The first one comes from the Center on Digital Hate, where they created what we call dummy accounts, right? So, you know, I can't see the algorithm, so I don't know exactly what they're doing. So the only way we can test it is by creating accounts and seeing what TikTok gives us, right? And so they did a version of this with 13-year-olds. So they made a bunch of dummy accounts, said they were 13. Within the first 3 minutes, each one of these accounts, regardless of whatever else they filled in as demographic, identity variables, anything, every single person or every single account, excuse me, was sent content within the first 3 minutes about self-harm. And what they were looking at is how long you looked at the video. Right? And so if you engage with the full video, they were like, okay, this person is going to take this on, right? And then they're going to give you more of that content. Now you can imagine, right, if it is a 13-year-old, they could be looking because they are actually engaging in that behavior, but they might also be like, oh my goodness, what is this, right? You can imagine how many things we have all watched digitally, just like being like, I didn't even know this was a thing, or I don't, you know, right? And that person's still going to get clocked as, oh, you liked this. Right? They're paying attention to how long we look. So they are dabbling with like different content to try to hook us in. And I'll talk about, but mental health TikTok is the largest community within TikTok of all the communities. So it's definitely the one they're trying to grab us onto. Another study that I wanted to highlight came out of Dublin in 2024, looked at content around what we would call the manosphere. Maybe some of you are know about this. This is sort of the incredibly misogynistic content that you could associate with people like Andrew Tate, but it's certainly beyond Andrew Tate, right, at this point. What they found was that within the first 9 minutes, people were sent a manosphere content type thing, so a misogynistic TikTok. What was really fascinating about this is in the first study I shared, they were just seeing, okay, you got self-harm, you got more self-harm content, right? What they found in this one was that you got the misogynistic content, and if you engaged with it in any capacity, then they started sending, over time, homophobic and transphobic content as well. right? So they're creating associations for people in their mind of like, oh, and literally it's kind of like, oh, you liked this, let me introduce you to this, right? And they're sort of testing how far you're willing to go with this content. And again, you can all think, well, okay, that wouldn't happen to me, but I hope you can appreciate there's a lot of people for whom this is a pretty serious issue. And the critical thing for me is that we call it, or I think about it as the algorithmic nudge, because it's really subtle. Right? I think like I say that to you and I'm like, within the first 9 minutes, there's manosphere content. And in our, none of us are looking at social media right now. We're all be like, well, I wouldn't look at that. Right? It's so easy to believe we would do the right thing. But think about it. The reality is half the time we're barely paying attention, right? We're just scrolling. We're like looking for the next thing. And also, right, this is so slow. So it'll give you like that manosphere content and then it'll show you 4 things you actually do want to look at. And then it'll go back to one manosphere thing, and then it'll show you a bunch of other stuff you really want to look at, and then it will show you the homophobic content, right? It's really subtle, because if it just pushed you, if it was just like, here's your first video, it's puppies, now self-harm, right? We would all be like, what is happening, right? It has to be a slow push, and so that is one of the, certainly the ways they are manipulating it. To build on that, I just do want to share so you're all aware, but the more you can do to acknowledge this, comment on it, participate in this actively, I would appreciate. As I said, mental health TikTok is the largest community within TikTok. It is also a community with rampant disinformation around mental health. This is a study from 2020, the end of 2022. They claim in the study that they looked at every mental health TikTok that came out in 2022. I don't know how they did that. They should all receive some sort of award for that if they actually looked at all of them, because there are so many of them. But they reported, like through their coding, that 84% of them contained misleading information about mental health. And of course, this runs the gamut, right? This runs the gamut from like, oh, I'm talking about my symptoms of depression, but they're unique to me and not universal, right? That could be a form of misinformation. To things that are really extreme, like maybe some of you have seen them, where people are filming themselves having a manic episode, right? That is their own experience. We don't even know if they're actually experiencing that or they're performing it, right? Really complicated. And also, here's the challenge. There actually are great people on TikTok sharing really important and helpful information about mental health, right? And for people that don't have access, right, we know there are what we would refer to as mental health shortages around the country where people literally cannot get access to a professional, right? I see the value in that, but there's so much of this that is disinformation. So much of it is couched as like it'll be a nutritionist or a life coach offering it, symptoms of ADHD or things like that. It has a lot of, impacts, of course, of disinformation, as any do. But the thing I also want to highlight is the alarming increase we're seeing in self-diagnosis of mental health disorders, and is directly from watching these videos, right? That people are watching people talk about their depression, and they're like, oh my goodness, that's me. And now they're saying, I have depression, right? And they're taking it on as part of their identity. And again, I'm thrilled with people who don't have access to that, seeing it, and then going to see a professional, right? That I would say is amazing. The challenge, of course, is that none of us can self-diagnose. Even the head of the American Psychiatric Association cannot diagnose themselves with a mental health disorder, right? It requires an outside professional. And so that is something to really pay attention to and to think about. And then, of course, thinking about how often these things are tied to consumerism. So we were looking at one in my mental health class the other day that was, talking about symptoms of depression, and it seemed like it was actually pretty helpful. Like, we looked at the first couple, and we were like, okay, yeah, this is good information. And then we saw, they're selling T-shirts, right? It's all tied to selling T-shirts, right? So just thinking about that, I think, is a really critical point. And then, the last big topic I wanted to highlight is this idea of watching the news and paying attention to current events. And it's so important. And I want to share that I'm really conflicted about this. And I'll share more at the end about that. But we know for sure that we are consuming news even when we're not looking at the news, right? So if you're like, oh, I haven't gone to the New York Times today, or whatever it is that you look at, you're still consuming news, right, on all these social media platforms. And a couple of things I really want to highlight. Going viral does not mean it's accurate, right? We have a tendency to believe that the things that are going viral, the things that are trending on all these platforms must be the most accurate. and that actually is not the case. There's all sorts of work behind the scenes, particularly around shadow banning on accounts, and some platforms do this around identity variables. So TikTok bans black content creators, shadow bans, black content creators, and some platforms sort of shadow ban around political content, all that kind of stuff. So the fact that we know, and also there are bots. Bots are swarming to make things go viral. So just thinking about that, that doesn't necessarily mean it. The other thing to think about is the fact that having an emotional response to things doesn't necessarily mean they're true, right? A lot of these things are designed to be as, to make us feel really strongly. Anger, sadness, scared, stress, those kinds of things. But just because we have that response doesn't mean it's true. And to our mental health, there is actually an emotional toll to consuming a lot of digital content. And we know this because of the experience in 2020 and 2021, while many people were watching the video of the murder of George Floyd over and over again, right? And again, this comes from the place of wanting to know, right? Wanting to be informed, wanting to understand what happened. But we do know that watching that repeatedly, or any type of content like that, it actually does impact our mental health. And the American Psychiatric Association has updated the criteria around PTSD to acknowledge that, social media can actually trigger or exacerbate symptoms of PTSD, right? So watching this content can have an impact on us. And of course, once we watch one, then the algorithm's like, here you go, here's all of them, right? And I'm really conflicted about this because I know this about our mental health. I also think it's really important to bear witness to things, and I think it's a real privilege to be able to say, oh, just don't look at that, right? Don't look at that, that's upsetting. I really genuinely am conflicted by this as an educator, but I do want to make you all aware of the fact that it does harm us the more we consume this stuff. But we, of course, all have to figure out our own balance around that. So I did want to leave you with a couple of positives. There are some positives in these spaces, and I just wanted to highlight them. Of course, you know about social connection. You're all engaging in social connection in those spaces. But for some people, based on their interests or aspects of their identity, those connections are really life-affirming. So I just wanted to share that. Engagement in topics and issues that people care about. The best antidote to hopelessness of any kind is engagement. And social media allows us to feel engaged and be part of something. And again, here's something we now have some longitudinal data on. A few years ago, I was always like, I don't know. I don't know if getting involved in climate change, activism on social media when you're in 10th grade has an impact on what you do as a young adult. I do know that now, and it does. We actually are seeing people stay engaged, actually develop further engagement. It's awesome. The ability to just have a little joy or a laugh in our lives should not be underestimated, especially. So I think I just want to highlight, I like to look at golden retrievers. So I just say, find your golden retriever, whatever that is. But I did want to highlight more seriously an actually really interesting study. This came from the female lead, but it's just they funded the research. It has nothing to do with gender identity. What they found was that by adding 5 accounts to your Instagram, that were genuinely based on something you either liked or really cared about or wanted to know more about, but it doesn't have to be grand. It could literally be, I like to bake, I'm gonna follow a baking account, right? It doesn't have to be anything fancy, but it can't be like, I like the way that person looks, right? That's a little bit, but it has to be a little deeper than that. If you add 5, it will, for the short term, not long term, but for the short term, it will trick your algorithm. Your algorithm will be like, oh, I guess this is what you like now. And it will start showing you more of that. So I actually do this myself. I do this with my family. We do it every couple months where we actually add 5 things and just try to sort of play around. It's a very small stakes. This is absolutely putting our fingers in the dam. We need the things like legislation and all of that to make a difference in this. But in the meantime, this is a small step we can take for ourselves that I think is really important. And the last thing I would leave you with, Liza was kind of alluding to this, but just sort of putting it into words, I would really encourage you to do maybe every couple months, a self-assessment of your social media. Again, this is something I do. My students do this all the time in reflection. But actually just thinking about, where do I feel connected? what makes me feel drained? Like, how do I know when I need a break? Having answers to those questions is really, really helpful, because what I want for all of you is, if you're like, I know that every time I go on Instagram, I'm gonna laugh, or every time I play video games, I'm gonna get that like boost that I need for 20 minutes to go tackle this work. That's where I want you to go. What we're doing so often is mindless consumption, and mindless consumption actually doesn't even give us the positive things that we're actually looking for in these spaces. So I will leave it there, and of course there's plenty of things we could talk about, but I guess we'll open it to questions, and thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it.
Okay, great.
Yeah, so thank you both so much for those illuminating presentations, and so timely and relevant, I think, to so many here tonight. But yeah, we'll just open it up to questions, comments for our awesome speakers, panelists here. If anybody wants to start off with a question or comment.
I've got one.
Yeah.
So I see the good, but that was a very small percent of your presentation. So I'm just wondering about abolition. Would we actually have been better off without MySpace and without cell phones, which obviously led to all of this? And it seems mainly to be about making billions of dollars for these companies. It seems like what's good is not worth what's bad.
Do you want me to start, or you?
Go for it.
I mean, I think so. I agree with you around the mental health, right? But if I were making slides of like, what do I think is good about social media more broadly, I would have more things to say. So just so you all know, like the power of what I would, we call counterpublics, like groups that are marginalized in the broader society, for those groups to have voices in social media spaces, that cannot be undermined, right? The power of that is quite profound, and you can think about it through Black Lives Matter, Me Too, all sort of the Arab Spring, right? That was sort of the moment where people were like, wow, we could use social media and we could harness it in these really interesting ways. So I think from an ability for people to have voice, and on a more basic level, I talk to a lot of kids who are like, I actually get to see people who look like me on social media when I don't in magazines or on TV shows, or they're dealing with things that I'm dealing with. And so I think that can be impactful. But I agree with you fundamentally that from a mental health perspective, I can't say there's more positive than good.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add is that I think there need to be many more restrictions on the companies, right? So, at this point, our office is not advocating to get rid of social media entirely. I think that's a really interesting question that you raised that's worth thinking about. But I do think it's critical for these companies to be held accountable, to make sure that they're forced to take into account youth mental health, and that they're required to put in place protections, for young people in particular and youth who are more vulnerable, but also for all users, right? And right now, there really aren't very many restrictions at all in terms of what these companies can do. And they are earning like billions of dollars, and earning that like on the backs of young people who are struggling with mental health in many cases. And so I just think, I think for me at this point, the bottom line and what we're really striving for at the AG's office in Massachusetts is to hold these companies accountable, require restrictions, require protection, so that youth mental health is the first priority, not the company profits.
Lauren?
Do you think that in some ways increasing restrictions on these social media platforms would have an unintended consequence and kind of diminish the purpose in like creating safe spaces for people that are marginalized? And like, would a heightened surveillance on media content like enable that, which would actually just make things worse?
Yeah, so I think the kinds of restrictions that we're talking about have to do with restricting the features, run into major First Amendment challenges when you talk about restricting content. Of course, there is exposure to harmful content that young people and users more generally are having, which is a whole other conversation. But from a legal standpoint, it's very hard to restrict like actual content for First Amendment free speech purposes. So what we've really been talking about in a policy space is restricting the company's ability to use these addictive features, like design features, in order to keep young people using the platforms for longer than even they would choose, right? And really focusing on, I mean, the amount of time that people can use, particularly young people can be using these platforms, teenagers, all of the kinds of features like the ephemeral content and the endless scroll and all of that, and putting some protections and limitations in place there. So I don't think that would have a really detrimental effect on like some of the positive. You still use social media. You could still connect with your friends. You could still get involved in social organizing on important issues, but it would limit the company's abilities to addict you to the platform.
Yeah, I think that's great.
Do you think age bans like the one imposed in Australia recently, do you think those are an effective way to manage some of the negative impacts of social media? Or would you advocate for other types of measures? Do you think it would just make it worse?
I could answer that question, but I'm interested in what you think.
So, I'm conflicted on it. I see the reasons why. I think 16 might be a little too old, though. I also think it very much depends on the platform, too. I think certain platforms are more addictive and more likely to expose you to different types of content than others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think those are good points. I mean, right now, the minimum age for most of these platforms is 13. One of the major problems is that age verification is incredibly challenging. So there are, millions of users under the age of 13, and these platforms can be even more harmful for young people who are, as Jill was saying, between the ages of 11 and 13, and there are a lot of users in that age category, and the companies know that there are a lot of users under the age of 13, and they're not doing anything about it. So I would say, like, number one is there has to be, better age verification and more enforcement of whatever the minimum age is. Right now it's 13. I do think there could be, it may be warranted to raise that minimum age a little bit, what the minimum age should be. I think, we would look to the research, and I would be interested in Jill's take on this. I think looking at the research in terms of where are the mental health harms the most serious, and I think we know for the younger adolescents in particular, there are more risks of harm. But again, I think the other thing we have to realize is that whatever the minimum age is, it's going to be incredibly challenging for the platforms to verify that age. So that's why we need to have other protections in place as well, and that can't be like the end-all be-all. It's not a solution that's going to solve the whole problem.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think, back to Orban's work where I was sharing, it was kind of like a bell curve. It really goes, if you want to think about it, 11 to 14, 15. That really shows everyone is 11 to 13, but we have a few late bloomers, right? And so they get covered in that 14 to 15. So I would say if I could wave my magic wand, I think that's kind of why they went with 16, is sort of to say, like, we kind of have a really good sense on younger, and why not just cover everyone with that? The thing I like about the age restriction is that at least it gives, you know, you don't have to worry so much about that FOMO stuff, right? It's like, in theory, again, I totally agree, everybody can get around it. But at least if most people aren't, you're not as worried about missing out on content. So one of the examples, like, I always give in my technology class is like the actual like old-fashioned phone that maybe your grandparents had in their house that was like attached to the wall was very, very slow to be adopted in the United States. Does anyone have any idea why? Why would it be really slow to have a phone? Because it would be exciting to have a phone, right? But what do you need for a phone? Yeah. You need somebody to call. So the problem was, if I got a phone, I was like the cool person, but I had nobody to call. Because if my friends don't have phones, like, what am I gonna do, right? And so, and in contrast, like a TV was super quick to be adopted, because if I had a TV in my house, I could invite everybody over and they could watch my TV, right? So technology that requires another person to have the thing tends to be slower. So one of the things I think that the age thing could do is if we have fewer people, let's say fewer 13 and 14-year-olds that have this social media, there's less of a desire for other 13-year-olds to be on it, seeing what their peers are doing, because there just aren't going to be as many of them posting. So I like that aspect of the age restriction particularly. But I would say for now, beyond that, like 13, 14, we're kind of throwing darts at the wall. Some people feel really strongly about 16. Some people feel strongly about 14. Some people are like, no one can handle it. Right. So it kind of runs the gamut on that.
14 does seem to be like a more logical number, because 14 is like the start of high school.
Yes.
I mean, and one thing that we've talked about is waiting until, like, there's this campaign of waiting till 8th for parents to give their children, waiting till 8 to give your kids a cell phone. And I'm kind of like, well, why 8th? Why not like 9th? Like, it seems like that transition to high school would make more sense in terms of giving your child a cell phone. And then social media, based on the research, like, I do think 16, like, my personal opinion, this isn't like the official position of my office, but like my personal opinion is 16 would make sense just based on what we know of the harms for that younger adolescent population. And like Jill said, you know, if not everyone is on it, you know, then it's not going to be a big deal because there aren't those social pressures. So I think if I were pushed on that, I would say that I would support the age gate, but again, it can't be the only solution because there are so many ways around it. There's another question.
You guys mentioned, I know you mentioned the loss of inner life, not being able to sit and like ask yourself a question or just sitting with boredom. I was just wondering if you thought that has always been like, that has been going on for like even before social media came, and if like other entertainment sources like television or like magazines have already been like targeting audiences.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I totally agree. Like, it's not like we've never been able to distract ourselves before this, right? And I, you know, I'm an academic, I'm a huge nerd. So I love to read, right? And that's how I'll be like, bad day, I'm gonna read my book, right? And it's like my ability to disassociate. So I absolutely agree that we can do this, and certainly, like, the fact that there's the Disney Channel and all these you know, even like networks that cater to younger audiences would suggest that like all media is trying to do this to us to some capacity. I think the difference with the phone in terms of that mood management is that it's just so much easier to carry it around. Right, we can even see a difference in like an iPad. People who have an iPad instead of a phone, like, it's just, you can't like, you know, carry it as easily around. I mean, you can put it in your backpack, and I suppose if you're on the subway, you could look at it, but you're not just like standing at a red light and you're gonna pull out your iPad. You know what I mean? Like, so I think it's that, like, it's the quick hits, actually, is like literally, to use the addiction language, it's the quick hits we get from our phones because they're just so close to us. And if any of you have ever like phantom thought your phone was vibrating and then you're like, oh, it isn't, right? That's like, that's an example of like just how close we are to this thing. So I think that makes it, it's not that we didn't ever do it, I just think now we're doing it so much more often and in such an amplified way. But it's a good point.
So obviously, these companies get a lot of data on like a day-to-day basis and like a year-to-year basis. Can you talk about how like 5 years ago how social media was different with the data that they had, and kind of where you see that going in the future too?
Can I share a personal example?
Yeah, sure.
So in my class, we talk about surveillance capitalism, right? So a huge way that these companies make money is by selling our data, right? And that's called surveillance capitalism. And so they are, in addition to generating ad revenue, one of the other reasons they want to keep us on their platform for as long as possible is to get more data, right? And really what they're looking at, like on a TikTok, is, they're looking at, would you look at here, and then would you look at next, right? Because that gives them much more insight than just like, Jill watched a golden retriever video, right? Who are they going to sell that to, right? Maybe Petco. But besides that, right, it's not a huge market. But if they know I looked at like 2 golden retriever videos, and then I went and looked at this celebrities content, and then I went and looked at this news thing, they can start to piece together a story about me. And that's what they're selling. They're selling the story about me. Where, to your question of like, what was different 5 years ago? So I don't know how many years ago Meta or Facebook got in trouble for, it was Cambridge Analytica, so 2021,
yeah.
2020. Okay, so a few years ago they got in trouble and they had to sort of share with people how they were categorizing you. So you used to be able to pretty easily go in and see how you were labeled, right? So based on what you looked at, how they had labeled you, and that's how they were selling you. Mine was so wrong. It was so wrong. And I was like, it was actually laughable how wrong it was. It said I liked soccer, and I don't dislike soccer, but I've literally never played soccer, right? And I was like, what content am I looking at that made you think I like soccer? It said I like the show Dexter. I've never watched the show Dexter, right? So it was really laughably wrong. And so I had my students do it, right? Because we're talking about surveillance capitalism, and they're all like, oh my God, this thing is so wrong. When we've done it in the last year or so, that thing is way more right. And so their ability to capture us and the nuances, and again, they're boxing it. They're like, I think she's probably this age range. I think she probably lives in this area. She probably has this income, right? And they're piecing together all of this story to sell a full story. The story's more accurate now. That's what I would say.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think the companies are just collecting a lot more data, and they've gotten to be much more sophisticated, to your point, in terms of understanding who you are and what content, what advertising content they can serve to you. It's become much more tailored and much more sophisticated. I'm sure some of you have had these kinds of experiences, but the other day I was with a couple of my friends. We decided to order pizza, and my friend ordered the pizza. I didn't order the pizza, but then I looked at my phone, 20 minutes later, and there was an advertisement for the exact place that we had ordered. So I don't think that was an accident, right?
No, it's not.
And so they're getting to be quite adept at knowing, exactly what you're going to tune into, what you're going to buy, what advertisements you're going to respond to. And I would definitely encourage you to watch the Social Dilemma documentary if you haven't already, because it really does dive into that exact question of like, what data are they collecting and how are they using the data?
Can I add one more thing about that? There's a researcher at Harvard, and their last name is Zuboff, and they have looked at surveillance capitalism for the last year or so in real depth, like been the focus of their research. And one of the things that they've noted that's shifted to 2023, 2025 time frame is, in addition to being like, I think you'd like this sweater, Jill, right? It's actually now doing what this author refers to as actuating, which is actually trying to encourage my behavior, so actually shift my behavior, right? So not just like, I'm targeting you with the things you already like, it's actually trying to change what I like and shift my preferences. And so that's another interesting factor, I think, that they were not into 5 years ago. It was very much more like, I know you shop at this place, here's an ad for it. Now it's like, you think you like that place, I'd like to encourage you to do these other things, right? So I think that's a little bit interesting, and I think ethically, our society, we should have more of a conversation about that these platforms are now trying to actually influence our behavior.
Another quick thought on this point is, I don't know if any of you remember when your feeds were just chronological. It used to be that your feed was literally just a chronological listing of all of your friends' posts. So whatever your friends posted about what they were doing, you would see that in chronological order. And then when you finished reviewing all those posts, it would say you're all caught up. we can see that it operates very differently now, and you're getting served content that's not from your friends. They're recommending content for you, and there's a whole algorithm, determining like what's going to be fed your way. And I think it's important to remember that it wasn't always that way. And we've had conversations about, well, maybe we should go back to the chronological feed, right? Because that's not as addictive. But that is one way in which it's changed.
I have a question. Can I had a couple questions. One was, I was just thinking about kind of difference in usage, even in sort of traditional gendered terms, and kind of when you were giving some examples of, if you're like a 13-year-old and you're watching like YouTube videos about like skateboard moves or like scooter moves, which my son is really into, and then you're out at the skate park for the whole day, trying to get that move, then you go back to the video, then you go back to real time, you're using your body in a three-dimensional way. And I see my son do that a lot more than my daughter, who I see mostly scrolling, and maybe she'll look at how-to videos, but maybe it's a makeup tutorial and again, I'm not trying to knock her, finding her joy in that space in that way either, but it's just, I feel like that's also just an interesting component that I'm sure there's emerging research on, and of course, social media is so important for many different identities in many important and complex ways. But it's just something that I see, and I see my son using social media in a much more social way. He oftentimes is doing it with his friends, whether they're playing video games together, or whether they're at the skate park together. Which, by the way, there are no girl-identifying skateboarders or scooter riders at our skate park, which I'm very bummed about. It's very gender segregated that way. But I just think that's interesting to think about, because I do see his use differently and how he's using it with his friends. And that's just one example. I don't mean to generalize, but I don't know if maybe teasing out the gendered usages and how they're different, I think is interesting. And then my other question was just thinking internationally, kind of piggybacking on Christina's question too, like thinking about how hard it's been to regulate Meta, and I'm so excited about your work, Liza, and these lawsuits and such. But, are there examples of nation states where they've been more effective in putting some regulation in place that seems like kind of common sense, shutting down sites more quickly that are encouraging suicidality, or shutting down sites that are clearly engaged in predation of young girls, and much more. But I think that would be kind of helpful to hear as well. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Do you want to take the gender?
Yeah, I can take the gender. Last year, I'll give you my lens on it. I last year did a project on TikTok. I was really interested in TikTok influencers for like a year and a half. And so one of the things that I was looking at is some of the sort of different aesthetics that were trending on TikTok, and a lot of the makeup videos and things like that. And it's really interesting because I do think, while I would talk to some people in interviews, by the way, all gender people who were interested in makeup, there were many people who were like, I love makeup as a form of self-expression, and it's super creative to me, and I love it, and I'm not caught up in like covering acne. Like, that's not what I'm doing here. I'm like, literally, this is like creative design for me. So I definitely talked to those people, but I would say the majority of the people that certainly felt like they were being targeted by this were young girls. And it was really interesting because maybe some of you are aware of these, but like a lot of the aesthetics that have trended, and I would add the trad wife in this example right now, a lot of the aesthetics are trending this really, really narrow vision of white femininity. So femininity, or what it means to be pretty, or, like the cool way to be right now, is very white. It's very much one version of femininity. We could add the clean girl aesthetic, all of these things that are sort of filtering into this thing. And again, it's like, it's sort of subconscious, I guess, right? Maybe Tradwife is not so subconscious, but like some of them before that, it was like, oh no, it's just a makeup aesthetic. Right, or it's just like a color aesthetic of what you wear, but just thinking about like, what your hair has to look like and things like that. So I think that's really interesting. That was sort of what I spent last year looking at, is sort of this push towards white femininity in digital spaces, and then the Tradwives came out, and that really answered the question on that. And then I think the other piece of that I think is really important to name is that when, a lot of girls would say to me like, well, those are real people. Like, it's better that I'm watching that than the Kardashians, because the Kardashians are super fake and I know they're fake. But these influencers are real people. And I think that's really interesting, right? Of course, those people were making maybe not Kardashian money, but they were making like a lot of money, right, on these like videos that they were making. And also they had a lot of editing. They had a lot of things going on, right? And somebody that was really popular in 2023 that maybe some of you know of, Alex Earl, right, who speaks a lot about how like liberated she is now that she doesn't have acne. Right, and how sad she was and how she never left her house when she had acne, right? And so you think about like, what's the message to a 14-year-old? The message is basically be really sad if you have pimples. But when you look like me, go to Miami for a weekend. You know what I mean? Like, that's really what they're selling. And so I think there's this, they're targeting that age group, they're targeting that gender, and they're really trying to like hook them in. And it is really feeling like I have to watch all of these to understand what I'm supposed to look like, right? The expectations on this. And then again, just recognizing how few people could actually meet that expectation of what they're selling.
Yeah, and I would just add to that that the research pretty clearly demonstrates like a disproportionate impact, negative impact of social media on the mental health of teenage girls, right?
And
like, so
Facebook's own data showed that. Right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
So I think Jill would agree. Like the research is pretty clear on that front that there is a disproportionate negative impact that we're seeing on the mental health of adolescent girls as compared with boys. And I think the example you give is like, you know, it's an anecdote, but I think that it gives you a sense of, you know, what may be going on there. I think, you know, boys aren't using it in the same way.
They're not,
like,
not in what I see.
as a broad category, obviously there are exceptions, right? But they're not getting like sucked into these like vortex and impacted in the same way about, you know, the social comparison, body comparison, you know, et cetera. So
the likes and all of that. And it's less isolative, sorry, anecdotally, but it's very isolative. I see for my daughter and her friends are kind of doing it in isolation and comparing themselves to this mythical norm.
Yes,
it's
exactly.
less social, and I don't know, interesting.
The only piece I've honestly wondered, and I don't have the answer to this, is I do think we've socialized teen girls to talk more openly about issues around social comparison and feeling, you know, like appearance and body image. Like we just do a better job of that. When I talk one-on-one with teenage boys, they are absolutely engaged in social comparisons. It's often under the guise of fitness or nutrition, working out, protein powders, right? You can think about all the ways that this can play out. But they are very much comparing themselves. So I don't know. Like, this is my anecdotal. What I don't know is that it actually might be, it looks like it's worse for girls. I actually wonder if everybody's up here. We just have socialized one group to talk more openly about it than other groups. But I don't know the answer to that.
Interesting.
And then in response to your other question, I think we're still learning, you know, from states across the country and from other countries about various legislative strategies that have been tried. I think the UK is one example where they have implemented a duty of care to young people, where the companies actually have to, again, you know, prioritize the interests and the mental health of young people on their platforms. But I think, you know, so many of these restrictions and different strategies are still relatively new, that we're still learning, you know, from them, and learning what the best practices are and what the best policies are and what the best restrictions are. I am very interested in the Australia, you know, example, but that was only very recently implemented, right? So we don't know. And the question and the issue there is around age verification, right? Like that is just a minefield of challenges when it comes to actually trying to enforce like an age gate. But I love the idea, you know, and I hope it works, and it'll be really interesting to follow, you know, how these policies play out and which of them are most effective in actually creating change. And I think we're still in the very early stages of understanding that as a country, but also internationally. I do think some countries are a bit ahead of us, but not all that far ahead of us.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. With regards to the lawsuits that are pending and the legal challenges to Meta, I know you can't share a whole lot more, but I don't know if you're maybe able to share sort of, were they kind of like holistic principles, or were there particular case studies? Was it about transparency or all of the above, or?
Yeah, well, our complaints are actually, have been made public.
Okay. So
They're
we can
like,
look them.
they're significantly redacted. But you can access them on our website. And so I would definitely like encourage folks who are really interested to check it out. But, you know, basically what we're saying, which this is public information, is that these companies, used psychologically manipulative tactics to hook young people on the platform knowingly, and then were deceptive, in what they represented to the public. So then they went out saying, "Oh, we prioritize youth mental health. This is really important to us," and yet they were making decisions that were very much deprioritizing youth mental health and prioritizing profits. Yeah. And so, so it's that deception that we're alleging is like a violation of our consumer protection law, Chapter 93A, because not only are they not prioritizing youth mental health, but then they are lying about that in public. Right. So that's one of the major claims. We've also made a claim about public nuisance in terms of the impact that it's had on schools and on communities and on the mental health system at large. Those are two of the main claims that we make in the complaint, but a lot of it is, you know, based on information that we got from the companies internally about, you know, what they knew and the information that they were using to develop their platforms, and then again, you know, kind of lying about it publicly.
It's like throw the camel.
It really is.
Yes.
It's like back to the cigarette companies.
Yep, it's absolutely the same. It's the same playbook.
Wow, that's so helpful.
Yep.
Thank you. Yeah. Any other questions? Any other last questions or comments? Anybody? Well, this was phenomenal. Thank you, Dr. Walsh. Thank you, Attorney Hirsch.
Thank you all for staying.
Yeah.